Hi, everybody. This is Akiko Fujimoto, music director of the Mid-Texas Symphony. And today I'm joined by our guest artist for our upcoming concert, Puttin on the Ritz, trumpeter Andrew Gignac. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, everyone.
Well, for those of you who know Andrew, of course, you've known Andrew for so many years as the principal trumpet of the Mid-Texas Symphony. How many years has it been, Andrew, with the symphony?
So I started as second trumpet back in, I think it was around 1994, 93 or 94,
30
somewhere in there.
years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then my good friend Bob Cannon was the principal trumpet player, and then he left the job in the early 2000s, and that's when I was promoted. So yeah,
That's fantastic.
yeah.
Well, we've heard you play, everything from the pictures and exhibition to Pines of Rome to so many great symphonic pieces. But today we're going to talk about the other side of your career, which is playing jazz. Let me backtrack a little bit. Andrew, you're not only a performing musician, but you're also a professor at San Antonio College, where
That's
you do
right.
jazz, but you also teach other subjects. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do there?
Yeah, so at community college, you have to wear a lot of different hats. It's a
Yeah.
big teaching load. It's a little bit different. I used to teach at university, and university is much less. It's more focused, kind of.
Mhm.
This is a little bit more versatile. So I teach music theory classes, ear training classes. I conduct two ensembles: a jazz ensemble and a brass ensemble, and I
Mm.
teach trumpet, of course. And then, of course, I help run the department. There's a lot of administrative stuff that goes with it. Yeah.
That
So
sounds like very busy, but
it's
very.
yeah, it keeps you on your toes. It
Yeah.
varies from semester to semester, and the student population is very, very diverse. It's very
Mm.
different than teaching at university, where you typically just have a university age students. The age range goes from, because now dual credit, you have high school students
Mhm.
all the way through people that are retired coming back to want to learn some stuff. So it makes, even though I teach a lot of the same things over and over, it's unique each semester because of the student population. So I love it. I've been doing it for a long time, and um, I, I used to teach at university, and I just to say I prefer teaching at community college.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, we're so fortunate that you not only play classical, but you also are very well versed in jazz. How did this dual, two style career? I know you play so many more things other than classical and jazz, but how did these two tracks start for you as a trumpet player?
It really started in high school. I mean, the jazz thing. My parents were big fans of swing jazz from the 30s and 40s,
Mm.
and they grew up dancing to that stuff. And one of the pieces that we're going to be doing next weekend is literally was my dad's favorite song, and that was "And the Angels Sing." That's
Oh,
one of the reasons I suggested it. And he used to tell me about this Ziggy Elman. You know,
yeah.
and I can remember, when I first started playing the trumpet, um, he finally got a recording of it, or a record, and he played it for me. And I looked at him, I said, I'll never be able to play that. I was like, you got to be crazy. That's no one can play that. It just sounded so impossible. But it was literally his favorite song. And I think him and my mom, they used to swing dance to that kind of stuff all the time.
That's
So
fantastic.
yeah, yeah.
What a great memory. And we want to talk more about Ziggy Elman and Angel Sing in a little bit, but um, I feel so fortunate to have you in our orchestra because I feel like I've thrown a lot of jazz inspired classical music at the orchestra since I've arrived. And like Gershwin and whatnot. And I
Mhm.
feel like you set the tone, I never have to worry like, well, is the orchestra going to be too square or too classical, because you're leading the way. Our concertmaster, Craig Sorge, is also very comfortable with the jazz, medium. I think his dad was was leading, or it was a drummer in a jazz band or something like that.
Mhm.
So we're like so fortunate to have you guys who are very comfortable with the style and get it. But for everybody else who play Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Mahler, normally, what are the challenges of kind of wearing the jazz hat when an arrangement or jazz inspired piece comes across your stand?
Yeah, it is a challenge, uh, so for me, when I have to play something like that in an orchestra, I can't do it exactly like I would do it if I was, say, playing with a big band. But I can't do it like a classical player either, because it won't sound right.
Right.
You have to approach that real jazz style where everyone else can kind of lock into it. And I have great colleagues in the brass section, and a lot of them are very competent jazz players. But
Yes.
I think that just having someone that knows how to play the rhythmic feel just right and the articulations right. Um, and I definitely learned all that when I was in high school, and then in college. I was in the college jazz band. It was a very good group, and um, so at the same time that I was learning all my orchestral excerpts and stuff like this, I was also getting to play and learning to improvise and this kind of thing. So um, yeah, so it's been kind of a dual thing for me for a long time. Um, I, uh, I don't do as much jazz playing these days as I do classical playing, and that's
Mhm.
for a while now. But it's amazing to me when I'm asked to do jazz, how quickly I can fall back into the way it's supposed to sound. Um, I this past fall, I have a couple of really great jazz colleagues at San Antonio College, and I organized a trio concert, and really put myself on the spot to do this, because I knew this program was coming out. I just wanted to kind of immerse myself in that language a bit, and it was
Right.
really really fun to do that. And get in front of a good audience and improvise and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's a cherished thing for me. I just I love to get to do it. Um, it's a language, and you were asking me earlier before we came on, how learning that, and I'm convinced that the way that you learn that isn't by studying books or
Mhm.
patterns or Jamie Abersol. All those things can be very, very helpful. But I think the easiest way, but it takes a long time, is
Yes.
you have to listen to players either live or on recordings, and
Mm.
mimic. It's a language. You got to learn it by mimicking. This is how babies learn how to talk. They
Right.
mimic. And I it this is how it becomes a natural thing. It doesn't feel unnatural. I hope it comes up that way.
Oh, yes,
But,
absolutely.
I,
Um,
I'm really looking forward to it.
yeah.
Jim
And
Valentine's arrangements are just so fantastic. So
yes. So for the audience tuning in, I just wanted to say the reason this whole program came together is, I was kind of itching to do a couple of pieces that by classical quote unquote composers
mhm.
that were inspired by jazz, which I'll talk about later. Jacques Ibert and Darius Biot. And I thought we should also play real jazz. And I thought, the first thing I thought was, well, Andrew is fantastic on jazz. So let's feature him. And when we started talking, I had suggested the Embraceable You arrangement that we had done together a couple years back during the pandemic. But then you suggested Puttin' on the Ritz and the Angels Sing. And you just mentioned that the latter was inspired by your dad's love of that song. But how did you come up with Puttin' on the Ritz, which I so appreciate, because as soon as you mentioned that, I said that's got to be the title of our concert, because that's so cool. Why did you want to do Puttin' on the Ritz?
Well, you mentioned the 1920s, and that was one of the most iconic hits from that era. That was, in this kind of, it's not ragtime. It's really approaching more of the swing jazz. It's got this amazing energy to it, and clever rhythm in it. So that, that popped in my mind right away when you said the 1920s.
Yes.
At the Embraceable You, you might not be aware of this, but there is a very famous recording of a very famous jazz trumpeter, a guy named Clifford Brown. Unfortunately, Clifford Brown, he didn't live there that long. He unfortunately was in a car accident when he was in his 20s. He was from Philadelphia. But in the 1950s, when he was like this superstar, the recording industry knew that this guy was something very special, and they recorded so much of him. And one recording, it's very famous because it's Clifford Brown with a string orchestra, and they do Embraceable You, and it's different than it's different than the arrangement that we're doing. The arrangement we're doing is fantastic, but it's an iconic recording, and it's great inspiration for me because I've listened to it all my life. It seems like
I have to go listen to it now, even if we're doing a different arrangement. I'm so glad you told me that, because if that's what trumpet players think of when they think Embraceable You, then I've got to study it, even if we're doing something different.
Yeah, there's several other really great recordings of it, but that's the only one I can think of with strings. And
okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. So that's Gershwin.
Right.
Puttin' on the Ritz is Irving Berlin.
Right.
And let's talk about Ziggy Elman. So Ziggy Elman, who wrote "And the Angels Sing," was Benny Goodman's trumpet player, right? And his band.
Yeah. So he's an interesting character. It's so funny because I mentioned Clifford Brown and that association with Embraceable You, a trumpet player, and of course, Puttin' on the Ritz, the big hit from the 20s. The famous recording, Bunny Berrigan is a very famous trumpet player, played the solo on that. And he was also a great composer. He wrote a very famous song that has been a torch song for many, many decades called "I Can't Get Started with You." And he famously sang it. He sang the lyric and then played, and almost every famous jazz trumpet player has covered that piece. And then Ziggy Elman, like Clifford Brown from Philadelphia, he was a Jewish guy that lived in this world of the swing jazz, but also this kind of Yiddish, kind of
play klezmer.
Klezmer, yeah. So there's this famous section in that piece where it goes into a hora staccato kind of thing, and he just goes crazy. So it's very interesting mix of the swing jazz and that. It's very, very interesting, and was very popular. It came out in 1939, and it went to the top of the charts, and people just loved dancing to it. Yeah.
That's awesome. And I found a YouTube of this piece that was in its original title, Freilich, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing the klezmer word right, but Freilich, which is a type of klezmer dance in swing. And it is "And the Angels Sing," but I think he originally wrote it like klezmer jazz, and then they put words to it, and
Right.
the angels sing, and it became so iconic and
Yeah.
beloved. So there's so many great jazz trumpet players in the music history. Who are some of your other inspirations or idols?
Yeah. So I would say that the first memory of hearing a recording of a jazz trumpet player was Harry James. My
Mm,
parents again loved that stuff, so they had records, this kind of thing. Um, and it's so funny how sounds affect the way you develop. So there was something about his sound that I can still hear in my sound sometimes. But certainly when I got studying jazz really seriously, the people that really stand out in terms of trying to imitate would be, of course, Clifford Brown, who I mentioned, Chet Baker from that same era,
yes.
Miles Davis, of course, just one of the greatest ever. But I want to do a big shout out to Dizzy Gillespie. We think of Dizzy
Oh, yeah.
Gillespie as kind of a showy person, but he was an amazing improviser and a great musician. And I had the amazing experience back in 1984 of getting to play an entire summer in a big band with which he directed. And
What?
oh yeah, it was so fantastic. We played all over the Southeast, these big outdoor concerts, and he was a mentor to me, and just
Whoa.
so kind. Um, he told all these amazing stories about the segregated South. He was from South Carolina, and that's where I was at
Okay.
school. And talking about playing all these gigs and yeah, not being able to stay in hotels where they were playing, and you
Yeah.
know uh,
Yeah.
also he was such an expert at Latin and Cuban music, and he was explaining all this rhythm. I just remember, just it wasn't just me, it was everyone just hanging on every word he would talk about. But he was just so giving and wonderful, so he was a great influence on
That's
me too.
amazing. I had no idea you like worked with him and
Yeah, yeah.
directly played with him and hung out with him. Now, when people think of a jazz band, people think saxophones, drums, piano, and of course trumpet. What do you think? Obviously, you're biased. You're a trumpet player, but what do you think? Is what are the things that the trumpet can do that other instruments can't do in jazz?
Yeah, so I think it. I mean, I am biased a little bit, but I do think that the great jazz trumpet players, uh, it's not necessarily just about their technique and stuff like that. There's something unique about each individual's sound. I mean, when you listen to a lot of Miles Davis, you realize you don't have to play a lot of notes to be incredibly profound. It's
Mm.
um, and and I recently watched this biopic of him, and it spurred me to get on Spotify, and the last few weeks I've just been listening to nothing but Miles Davis,
Ah!
and it's funny, that sound that he has is just you know he could play anything, and you would just be hanging on just the sound. And I think the great improvisers, trumpet players, that you know it's not just their ability to be creative in the moment. It's also to touch people with their sound, and I think other instruments can do that certainly too.
Yeah.
I mean, saxophone, trombone, horns like that. I think it's harder for pianists to do that
Mhm.
because the piano is going to sound a certain way, but they have other ways of getting that across to people. So I think it has to do with the sound. What kind of emotion you can bring to that. I think, to maybe a little lesser extent, it's like that in classical music too.
Mm,
Great chamber musicians, they typically have some beautiful, unique sound or something special about it.
yes.
Certainly soloists.
Yes,
Yeah.
for sure. And it's so personal to each musician that's producing that sound. And I think sometimes maybe for non-musicians, it's easier to focus on the digital aspect of the notes, like fast notes, slow notes, melodies, rhythm. It's that's much easier to define.
Mhm.
But the sound, like as you're describing it, is so personal, and it can be so poetic and expressive. And just by holding a note, you can say so much. Um, on every instrument. And can you talk maybe a little bit about that as a player? I don't know if it's conscious or subconsciously, you've always had your sound, but how hard do musicians work on having just the sound, like the producing sound production for
Yeah,
it?
I mean, this is a big thing for brass players
Yeah.
because just the physical nature of playing the instrument. So I think brass players more than any other the orchestral instruments work on basics more. I mean, I say that, but I mean, I have so many string player friends. Uh, I play this amazing festival every year in California, and these amazing musicians there. And I'm always struck by listening to these amazing violinists warm up, doing these
Mhm.
very slow scales, and just getting their sound. But I think brass players, you're a brass player. You have to do that kind of thing every day to get everything working right. And
Mhm.
so, it's, uh, I think that's, for me, it's finding that the core of my sound every day. And it's always the first thing that I try to do when I practice. And it's
Mm.
funny, you know that I'm married to another trumpet player, and
Yes.
she has a very unique sound.
Yes.
And, I hear that almost every day because we live in the same house. And so um, sometimes I get into this, oh, I wish I could sound like that. And
Mm.
then I take a step back and go, but no, that's not really how I sound. I mean, it is a
No.
very personal thing.
It's like a
Um,
fingerprint, like for your
yeah,
identification. I think it's like only you have that fingerprint, like,
yeah,
in
yeah,
the FBI files or something, or if you're a criminal or something, you have that finger, you can be identified because it's so only unique to you. And I think a sound on a musical instrument is like that.
yeah.
Um, so, um, before we go, let's talk about James Valentine. So he is the arranger of um, for this
Putting on
concert, Putting on the Ritz and the Angels Sing. We specifically commissioned him to do these two arrangements. And I know you're friends, great friends,
yeah,
and
we have been for a long
I met
time.
him initially through the Musical Offerings Jazz Meets Classical concert that John Christensen used to put on in San
Mhm.
Antonio. But I thought of him first because he's somebody that crosses over classical and jazz. How did you meet him, and did you work together on these arrangements?
Yeah, so we met my junior year in undergraduate school because he came in
What?
to be one of my main professors. Yeah, so uh,
Oh my
I
God.
the the amazing jazz band that I got to play in undergraduate school. The person that ran it the first 2 years I was there, he took another job, and they hired Jim to come in, and he became my most important mentor in undergraduate school. Yeah,
Whoa.
so I not only studied jazz with him and played in his jazz band. He also convinced me to sing in a jazz choir, which is a very humbling
Gosh.
experience, but it's great for your ear. Oh my
Yes.
goodness.
Yes.
Um, and But I also studied composition with him, and he is also the person that mentored me to get into a good graduate school. And he sent me to the University of South Carolina, where he had gotten one of his degrees, and one of his main mentors there became one of my main mentors also. So we
Wow.
had this great connection there. And so, of course, I went off to graduate school and did all this stuff. And then I come to San Antonio, and about a little after I got here, he got hired at UTSA,
Yeah. Yeah.
and had a long career there. He's retired from there now, but
Yes.
so it was a great thing because we've been friends for so long, and
That's crazy. I didn't
yeah,
know that.
yeah, yeah.
That's crazy. Well, Jim and his wife will be in the audience at the concert. So, what a great thing. And he mentioned that you guys talked about the arrangements before
Yes,
he hit send.
absolutely. Yeah. So, he, the putting on the Ritz. I mean, he offered me, maybe two different versions of one section of that, one based upon the Bunny Berrigan solo, and one based on another thing. And the Bunny Berrigan thing is much closer to the way I would probably play in that style. So it
Okay.
was easy for me to take that and kind of make it my own. So
Okay.
that was very handy for him to do that. Um, and of course, he's so inventive with his orchestrations and his clever use of rhythm and stuff like that. He just has great craft. Um, but then in the Angels Sing, it's funny. In the Angels Sing, I that mentor I've told you about at the University of South Carolina, who was Jim's mentor also.
Mhm.
Um, he had this dance band that I would sub on when I was in graduate school, and
Mhm.
they were, they were a real working band. They worked all the time, and had this amazing book of original charts that this guy wrote. But Jim Ballantyne actually wrote some of the charts in that book. So he's retired now, but he still lives in South Carolina. But his daughter lives in Bernie, and she teaches at a school up in Bernie.
Oh
And
my goodness.
she convinced him to come and bring the book, and we put together a band and play some of the stuff. And
Wow.
this was a couple of years ago. And he contacted me. He said, "Would you play And the Angels Sing?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely. I'll be glad to do it." And so he brought his arrangement, which was good. It was a good arrangement. Um, but as you know, at the end of the arrangement that Jim does, it ends in A major concert, concert pitch A major, and that's how the original thing did. But Dick, writing for a band that was going to be playing dances and stuff like this, he just made it in B flat because it's less dangerous key, this kind of thing.
Oh.
So when Jim was talking to me about that, he said, "Do you mind if we do the end in the original key? It makes more sense, the key relationship to the other thing."
Yeah.
And I said, "Absolutely, half step lower. That's great."
Wow. That's great for many reasons.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
But
I had no idea.
yeah, so
That's
so it's
neat.
much more original the way Jim's done this. So
Yeah.
it's,
Faith. Well, it's great that he gets the original, like the art form and the tradition, and he is able to respect that in his
oh yeah,
arrangement for
absolutely.
today or for next week. So that's amazing. I had no idea that you went that far back with
Oh
Jim.
yeah,
So
yeah.
how lucky are we that we have your collaboration on this concert. So, well, great. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for
You
chatting
bet.
with me about this. We're so looking forward to this concert. It is sold out, I think. So I hope everybody who has a ticket comes. And we're just so looking forward to hearing you play all
Yeah.
these great jazz tunes. So thank you
Please,
so much, Andrew.
yeah, please say hello afterwards. I'd love to meet some of you guys that are streaming right now. Classical music just won't exist without an audience, and we just so appreciate the support that you've been giving the Mid-Texas Symphony.
Yes. Thank you so much, Andrew.
All
We'll see
right.
you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, that was our principal trumpet, Andrew Gignac, who will be our soloist on the second half of our concert Puttin on the Ritz. So that was so fun talking to Andrew about his three pieces. That I'm running out of time to talk about the other stuff, but just real quickly, I want to give you an overview. So this concert, as Andrew mentioned, focuses on not only jazz, but specifically the jazz age, the 1920s and the 30s, when jazz basically took over the whole musical world. The golden age, post World War I, everybody was kind of being extravagant and free and a little bit crazy. This is when jazz in America was starting to spread to the rest of the world, and all the great musicians around the world, especially in Europe, were catching on to and falling in love with jazz. So we're starting the concert with a precursor of jazz, which is ragtime. We're starting with U.B. Blake's Charleston Rag. A lot of you might know Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag, which is the most famous rag. But this U.B. Blake one is also very famous and virtuosic. And U.B. Blake lived to be almost 100 years old, I think. So he was alive for a lot of 20th century and kept playing and kept teaching and composing. U.B. Blake really became a household name in the 1920s when he wrote a Broadway musical, Shuffle Along. But his career really started playing in bars and clubs as a ragtime pianist. Now, what is ragtime? Ragtime is believed to have started as a combination, of course, African slave music and Irish music of the slave owners, and the rhythm with syncopation, which is when an emphasis is on in between the notes instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. If they want on the ands. So if I were singing Mary Had a Little Lamb, straightforward, Mary had a little lamb. In rag, it might be Mary had a little lamb. It would be on the offbeats. So that was a great thing to rag, to be looser, to not be so square. And that really caught on. And in the late 1890s, it started with the publication of Maple Leaf Rag, 1897. And until jazz really kind of replaced it in 1917, that 20-year period was the heyday of ragtime music. And U.B. Blake was a teenager in 1899. I think he was all of 14 or something like that. But he wrote this great piece, and he called it a test piece. So it wasn't just like a nice, relaxing rag. It was a competitive rag. So if you wanted to, show somebody how good you are on the piano, this is the piece that he would play. So it was a competitive ragtime piece. And you can still find recordings and videos of him playing this himself, but this is an arrangement by another composer conductor, 20th century pedagogue and composer conductor Gunther Schuller, who was very known for kind of more edgy contemporary music, but he also loved jazz, and he arranged this for a small orchestra. So we're happy to kick off the concert with U.B. Blake's Charleston Rag. And then we move on to T42 by Vincent Youmans. He was a Tin Pan Alley composer and pianist. Tin Pan Alley was this section of New York, this few blocks in New York City, where a bunch of music publishers were operating. and a lot of jazz, vaudeville, ragtime, and Broadway songs were being written and being sold. So in order to sell them, they would hire these great pianists to play those arrangements, and leave the windows open. And there was so much noise, cacophony of different pianists playing different arrangements up for sale, that it sounded like tin pans were just dropping, in the kitchen. So that's how the alley was named Tin Pan Alley, and Vincent Newman is very much from that tradition. He was a pianist for one of those publishers in Tin Pan Alley. And this piece inspired a lot of arrangements, and even for a classical composer. Dmitri Shostakovich wrote this on a dare from Nikolai Malko, a conductor in the 20th century, that he couldn't possibly arrange this song after hearing it. And he did it, I think, in a very short amount of time. That's not the version we're playing today. We're playing something that's a lot more close to the original T42, but later it wound up being used for Newman's musical No No Nanette, which went on to be a great hit on Broadway. After that, we're playing Sophisticated Lady by Duke Ellington. Of course, Duke Ellington was one of the greatest jazz band leaders, composers, pianists. This was from a little bit later, 1932. And originally, Ellington had meant it to be about grade school teachers. There were these sophisticated ladies that he studied with that taught during the academic year, but went off to travel in Europe during the summer, and he thought that was very sophisticated. So it was an ode to his grade school teachers, but later more romantic lyrics were attached to them, and it became a very iconic song made famous by Ella Fitzgerald and so many other singers. So, but originally it was for a little bit of different meaning. We're playing a beautiful string orchestra arrangement of it, this Sophisticated Lady. So we're very excited about that. We're going to end the first half with one of the pieces I mentioned when I was chatting with Andrew. So this is kind of the first, what you would call classical music in the European sense. And this is by French composer Jacques Ibert. Jacques Ibert wrote this in 1929 as incidental music for a play called An Italian Straw Hat. This was a French farce, a comedy, and a satire that had been translated into many, many different languages, performed in many different versions across the world, but especially a mainstay in France. And it takes place in Paris. And I don't want to go into the whole story, but it's a very convoluted comedy of a guy who is about to get married in about 3 hours. And the bridal party is on their way in a caravan of 8 cabs. And he comes into, he is in a bind that he has to resolve before the wedding so that he can marry his beloved safely and successfully. But in order to do that, he has to overcome a great challenge of finding an exact type of Italian straw hat that his horse bit off on his way to running all the pre-wedding errands. And much hilarity ensues, and a lot of misunderstandings and coincidences and confluences. And at the end, he does get to marry his fiancée safely. But this music is just as fun as a story. And a year after he wrote it for the play, he compiled it into a suite for a chamber orchestra. Now, everything on this concert is for a chamber orchestra, which means it's not the big 70, 80-piece orchestra that you're used to seeing. I would say the biggest group we have maybe is 30 players, but some pieces are done with fewer players. And in the 20th century, especially after, there were two things. There was definitely a revolt among composers against the lush romantic music of the 19th century with gigantic orchestras and big sounds. So just based on that, some composers wanted to go into more stark, austere, clean, intimate sound of smaller groups. But also World War One lost a lot of musicians to war. So they had to, a lot of orchestras could not carry on and play the large works that they used to before the war. So they had to do things for smaller groups. And for that sad reason, inadvertently, history wound up producing a lot of chamber orchestra works. So the Iber is also for that. And of course, you got to have a smaller orchestra in the pit, in a theater. That's not necessarily a humongous opera house. So it's a lot of theatrical works are for small orchestras for that reason as well. So this Iber music, it's about 16 minutes in total. It comes in 6 movements. It starts with an overture, kind of very hyperactive. And then the second movement is cortege, a procession, which is usually a funeral procession. But in this case, I think it's referring to a wedding procession. And it even has a quotation of Mendelssohn's wedding march, which I think you'll recognize. It comes up a couple times. So you can already get a sense of the sense of humor that Iber put into this piece. And then the third movement, Nocturne, reminds me of a noir film. It seems like it could be a soundtrack to a very dark film. And then the fourth movement is a waltz. It's a caricature of famous waltzes like the Blue Danube, that Viennese Strauss waltz tradition. The fifth movement, Parade, is a militaristic march. It almost reminds me of the armed forces medley that we often play in patriotic concerts. And the last movement, finale, is a gallop. There are a lot of references to popular music. Iber was very much influenced by popular music and jazz, and he refused to be categorized as one type of composer. And this was also the time when jazz and other popular music was infiltrating Europe and influencing, so-called art music composers too, and avant-garde music. So Divertissement is a lot of fun, and should leave you kind of laughing. It's supposed to be funny, and it's supposed to be unexpected and irreverent. The other piece is the last piece of the second half, so the end of the concert. And this is a piece by Darius Milhaud, another French composer. This is also from the 1920s, specifically 1924. And this was music written for ballet. And Darius Milhaud was a French composer who, during World War I, also went to work in Brazil. So he fell in love with Brazilian music and also with jazz. He went to London and heard an American jazz band play and just absolutely was gobsmacked. So he actually made a special trip to Harlem in New York, in the United States, to go hear real jazz. There he saw a jazz musical called Liza. And he took the instrumentation from that musical that he saw in Harlem and then brought it back to this Swiss ballet company and wrote music for ballet called A Creation of the World. Milhaud was very much interested in music of other cultures, and he was very inspired by the Swiss poets anthology of the African, it's called the African Saga, but it's an anthology of 103 original folk tales from Africa. And he took the part about the creation of the world, the birth of nature, animals, plants, and then eventually human beings. And he created music about that for this ballet company. This piece came out a year before Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, which is maybe the most iconic jazz meets classical piece. So you can kind of see in what world Mio was living. And jazz, this was not his last encounter with American music. He actually immigrated to the United States later in life, and he became a professor at Mills College in California. And he taught the likes of Burt Bacharach and Dave Brubeck, a very famous American jazz composer. So, you know, he spent the second half of his life in America, but he made a special effort to discover. And I totally understand the desire to want to go to the birthplace of music that you love, because if you don't breathe the air, if you don't eat the food, if you don't talk to the people, and if you don't hear the, original music where it started, how can you take ownership of it? And Leonard Bernstein, who conducted and recorded this piece, Creation of the World, said, this piece is not just lip service to jazz. It's a real deep commitment to jazz. It's in 6 movements. It starts with an overture. And the second movement is called the Chaos Before the Creation. And these 2 movements, the overture is kind of slow, and the chaos is, of course, faster. It's in the style of rumba. You feel like you're in the middle of New Orleans or something. And it harkens back to Baroque music, prelude and fugue. So the overture is the prelude, so to speak. And the chaos movement, the second movement, it's a literal fugue. You'll hear the string bass come in, and then you hear all, with this theme subject of the fugue, and then you'll hear different instruments of the orchestra, virtually everybody chiming in with a version of that fugue subject. But you might not even think about Baroque music, because the rhythm is jazzy, and the harmony and the instrumentation, the drum, the percussion, the battery of percussion that's involved in this is crazy. So it's a very jazzy fugue. So it's a fantastic beginning to the piece. The third movement is the birth of the flora and fauna. So you'll start to hear little primordial bubbles of life emerging. It's very slow music, kind of going back to the overture music, but now you start to hear a little thing wiggling here and kind of slowly rising to the top. And you hear hints of blues. So definitely a big jazz influence there. And then after the birth of flora and fauna, you have the birth of man and woman. This sounds more urban, maybe not unlike the music he heard in Harlem. Maybe it's life, but with logic or reason. If we can call ourselves logical or reasonable, Homo sapiens. So this is a birth of man and woman. And then the following movement is the desire of man and woman. So now we're going into mating and procreation. So this is a very, it's kind of a history of the beginning of life on Earth. And the last movement is very peaceful. After a lot of jazzy activity, we end in peaceful, kind of a wink, wink kind of ending, epilogue. And that's called the peace or appeasement. And the animals are gone, and the man and woman are left on stage. We're not doing it with dancing this time. We're just doing the music. But in the ballet, just a man and woman are left on stage, and they walk off, arm in arm. So this is a very exciting piece of music. I think even though you'll hear the jazz influence, you'll also hear the classical underpinning. And to me, this is the ultimate jazz meets classical piece. And in closing, I want to say that ragtime and jazz, I think a lot of people will say, and I have to agree with this, that is our classical music in America. What is the definition of classical anyway? Because of Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, these European, Central and Eastern European composers that we love over the last 300 years, we tend to think of it as a classical, basically a European art form. But I listened to a podcast lately of classical music where a trumpet player, Chris Gecker, was a guest. And the host asked him, well, what do you think is the definition of classical music? And Chris Gecker, I think, said something to the extent of, to him, it's music, great music that endures the test of time. And these jazz pieces that we're hearing on this concert, Puttin on the Ritz, and Embraceable You, and The Angels Sing, Tea for Two, Sophisticated Lady, all these are songs that endure. They might have been arranged by so many different people, but they endure to this day, and they're going to endure forever because they're great music and great melodies and harmonies and songs. So I think that we can say that jazz, and before that ragtime, are our classical music. And classical composers and jazz composers completely hybridized the two art forms themselves. Duke Ellington wrote several jazz symphonies like Black, Brown, and Beige, Harlem. Therefore, big full orchestras, classical orchestras, but jazz music. I mentioned that Shostakovich, arranged T42 on a dare. And of course, we're talking, Ibert incorporated a lot of popular music idioms into his compositions, and Mio, that I just discussed, was the poster child for that. So I think both sides of the aisle respected each other and absorbed each other and created something so unique, whether it's French, American, or African, or all of the above. So I think, to me, great music is great music, and it's always exciting to find intersection of multiple cultures and genres. And it's exciting to hear a musician like Andrew Gignac, who embodies the intersection of so many different art forms. So your Mid-Text Symphony is so good at playing both in so many different genres. I really appreciate the musicians of our symphony. Thank you so much. And we will see you at the Brontex in a few weekends. See you then. Bye-bye.